Hello and welcome to today's deep dive. I am your host, and today we are getting into a topic that completely changed the modern world.
And I am your expert guide for this journey. I am really thrilled to be here. We have a massive stack of research to unpack today.
We really do. Okay, I want to start today with a little word association game. If I throw the word romantic at you right now in the 21st century, what is the absolute first image that pops into your head?
I mean, for most people, it's the obvious stuff. Candlelight dinners, Valentine's Day cards, maybe a montage from a rom-com where they, run through the airport in the rain.
Exactly. You think of love, hearts, sentimentality, maybe some cheesy R&B music playing in the background.
Right, totally.
And here is where the sources for this deep dive get really interesting. If you said the word romantic to someone in the late 18th century, they would not be thinking about a date night. They would be thinking about a riot.
That's right. They wouldn't be thinking about chocolates. They'd be thinking about a brawl. It wasn't about romance in the modern sense at all. It was this profound cultural insurrection against the dominant way of thinking at the time.
We are talking about the Romantic Rebellion. And looking at this stack of research, the art history, the philosophy, the political analysis, this wasn't just a new style of painting or a trend in poetry. It was a total cage match for the human soul.
It really was.
On one side, you had the Enlightenment, the heavyweight champion of logic and reason. And coming into the ring to challenge it was Romanticism, prioritizing the heart, intuition, and the wild, untamable parts of the human experience.
It's a fascinating conflict because it fundamentally reshaped art, religion, and politics. It challenged the idea that reason is the only way, or even the best way, to understand the human condition.
So, our mission for this deep dive is to figure out how a movement entirely about feelings managed to change the world so drastically that we are arguably still living in its aftershocks today. To do that, we have to look at what they were rebelling against. We really need to set the scene for you.
You have to understand the status quo of the 18th century. This was the height of the Enlightenment. Isaac Newton had figured out gravity. Science was just exploding. The intellectual world was entirely obsessed with the idea that the universe was a machine.
A machine, like literally.
Yes, the clockwork universe. That is the defining metaphor you see in all the literature of the time. The belief was that the universe is a giant, complex, but ultimately predictable clockwork mechanism.
Okay.
And the implication there was that if you used enough cold, calculating scientific thought, rigorous logic, and empirical analysis, you could understand absolutely everything.
So knowledge was only valid if you could prove it with a logical syllogism or a mathematical equation.
Precisely. If you couldn't measure it, weigh it, or put it into a formula, it basically didn't exist. It was a world of sterility and control. Emotions were seen as messy, unreliable, and frankly, irrelevant to the pursuit of truth.
Right.
Think about it. If you were designing a bridge, you don't want feelings involved. You want math.
Yeah, I definitely don't want the engineer to feel like the bridge is sturdy. I want them to know.
Exactly. But the Enlightenment thinkers tried to apply that bridge-building logic to being human. They wanted to categorize and systematize the human experience just like they categorize beetles or stars.
Which sounds incredibly stifling if you are, a human being with actual emotions. And this is where we get our first real plot twist in the narrative. The guy who really kicks off this rebellion, Jean-Jacques Rousseau,
Yes.
looking at his background, he was actually one of them, right?
He was. Rousseau was a highly prominent Enlightenment thinker. He moved in those exact circles. But he started to feel that the era's reliance on strict reason was just missing the point of existence.
He turned against his own.
He famously turned against what he called the rascally deists of his time.
Rascally deists. I love that insult. It sounds like something a pirate would say.
It is very vivid. He was critiquing the idea of a distant clockmaker god. The deist view was that God created the machine of the universe, wound it up, and then walked away to let it run on physics.
Like a hands-off manager.
Exactly. Rousseau hated that. He argued that God was benevolent and, crucially, accessible through personal affection, not just detached observation.
So he's basically saying, I don't need a telescope to find the truth. I need to look inside my own chest.
That is the pivot point right there. Rousseau validated the inner self. He argued that your feelings, your passions, and your subjectivity were just as important, if not more so, than your rational self. He is really the forerunner of the whole movement because he gave people permission to trust their gut over a textbook.
That is a massive shift. You go from Descartes saying, I think, therefore I am, to Rousseau essentially saying, I feel, therefore I am.
And once that dam breaks, it seems like it flooded into absolutely everything. It wasn't just philosophy anymore. It changed how people painted, how they wrote music, even how they looked at a mountain.
Well, let's talk about the visual arts, because the change there is incredibly stark in our sources. If you look at neoclassical art, the art of the Enlightenment, it's very balanced, symmetrical, and calm.
Right. It looks like a posed photograph. Everyone is standing still, usually wearing a toga, looking very serious and rational. It's essentially propaganda for order.
Then you get Caspar David Friedrich.
Right, right.
Ever seen his painting Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog?
Oh, absolutely. It is the cover image for almost every book on Romanticism. It's that classic image. There's a guy standing on a rocky precipice, his back is to us, and he is looking out over this swirling, misty, jagged landscape.
It is the quintessential romantic image for sure, but let's unpack why for a second. Notice the focus. It's a lone figure. Individualism was huge for the Romantics. But look at the nature he is facing. It isn't a manicured garden.
No, it looks dangerous, rugged. If he slips, he dies.
That is what the Romantics called the sublime.
The sublime. Okay, we need to pause on this word because we use it very differently today. You might say, oh, this cheesecake is sublime.
Right, meaning very good or tasty.
But in the Romantic context, and specifically in the philosophical definition by Edmund Burke, the sublime refers to a feeling of awe mixed with terror. It is the feeling you get when you stand on the edge of the Grand Canyon or in the middle of a violent thunderstorm.
You feel tiny.
You feel small, and nature feels overwhelmingly powerful.
That is a huge contrast to the Enlightenment view, where nature was something you categorized, labeled, and completely controlled.
Exactly. The Enlightenment wanted to tame nature, turn it into a garden or a farm. The Romantics wanted to be overwhelmed by it. They wanted that feeling of trepidation and triumph. It was about feeling alive. They wanted the world to be less of a map and more of a mystery.
And you can hear this shift, too. It wasn't just in the galleries, it was in the concert halls. We have to talk about Beethoven.
You cannot talk about Romanticism without Ludwig van Beethoven. He is the absolute bridge between the classical and the Romantic eras in music.
So before Beethoven, music was what? Polite.
In a way, yes. It was the era of neoclassicism. Think of Mozart or Haydn. The music was beautiful, genius even, but it was restrained. It followed strict forms. It was balanced.
Okay.
It was often intended as background art for aristocratic gatherings. It wasn't supposed to make you sweat. It wasn't supposed to ruin your day.
And then Beethoven comes along and decides to just break the furniture.
Essentially, yes. Around 1804, Beethoven really breaks from his classical training. He stops writing music that is just technically perfect and starts writing music designed to evoke raw, specific human emotions.
We are talking about pieces like the Eroica.
The Eroica is the game changer. It was massive. It was loud. It had dissonant chords that didn't resolve when you expected them to. It was actually jarring for audiences.
So instead of polite applause, he wanted what?
He wanted you to feel fear, rapture, longing, pain. The sheer volume and intensity of his work were shocking at the time. He moved music away from that mechanical precision of the Enlightenment and made it a vehicle for intense individual experience.
Wow.
When you listen to his later symphonies, you aren't listening to a mathematical exercise. You are listening to a man wrestling with fate.
It's interesting because in both the painting and the music, there's this profound rejection of the machine. They don't want the world to be a clock. They want it to be a storm.
That is a perfect way to put it. And that sentiment carried over directly into literature. You see writers abandoning the rigid structures of the past to try and capture that storm.
Like William Wordsworth.
Yes, Wordsworth is a giant here. And his rebellion was interesting because it was a rebellion of language itself. He completely abandoned the high-flown, complex classical poetry styles. He wanted to use what he called ordinary language.
Which sounds simple to us now, but I guess that was the radical part back then.
It was deeply radical because, up until then, poetry was for the elite. It was full of Greek mythology and complex metaphors you needed a university degree to understand. Wordsworth said, no, I'm going to write about ordinary objects. A cloud, a flower, a peasant girl.
So it was a democratization of the art form.
It was. But he was also finding the mystical in the ordinary. He believed we have a deep, almost spiritual connection to nature. He argued that we can only truly know ourselves by contemplating the created order.
Again, rejecting the industrial view of things.
Completely. He hated the idea of the world as a factory or a machine. For Wordsworth, Nature was a place of glorious contemplation.
Now, speaking of literature, this is where the research gets really surprising for me. When I look at the notes here, I see the Grimm brothers, and I am thinking, okay, Cinderella, Snow White, what do fairy tales have to do with a philosophical rebellion?
This is one of those connections that people often miss, but it is highly critical.
Mm.
The Grimm brothers, Jakob and Wilhelm, weren't just writing stories for kids. They were serious scholars. They were linguists.
Okay, so what was their actual project then?
They were traveling through the German countryside,
Yeah.
collecting these folk tales, stories that had been passed down orally by the common people, because they were looking for something very specific. They were looking for the soul of the German people.
The soul of the people.
They called it the Volkgeist. And this connects us to a major political outcome of Romanticism, which is nationalism.
Wait, so Cinderella is political propaganda?
In a sense, yes. See, before this period, your loyalty was usually to a king or a specific local lord. Germany wasn't even a country. It was a patchwork of little states and principalities.
Right.
But the Romantics, by focusing on history, folklore, and shared culture, helped create the idea of a nation. Now, it is important to note here, we are just looking at the historical mechanics of this. We aren't endorsing the political movements that followed. We are just explaining what the sources tell us about how this shift occurred.
Absolutely. We are just looking at how the ideas functioned. So the Grimm brothers were basically saying, hey, look, we all tell the same stories. We all speak the same dialects. We are the same people.
Exactly. By documenting folk culture, they fostered a shared cultural identity. It wasn't just storytelling. It was a political tool to make people feel their common heritage. It is that shift from, I am a subject of this king, to, I am a German, and this is our spirit.
So Romanticism provided the emotional glue for nationalism.
It provided the emotional fuel.
Yeah.
You really can't have modern nationalism without that romantic emphasis on feeling deeply for your own history and people. It creates an us.
It seems like Romanticism was essentially a revival of feeling in every possible sector. We have done art, music, literature, politics. What about religion? Because the Enlightenment was pretty tough on religion, right?
The Enlightenment and certainly the French Revolution have been very critical of the church. They saw it as superstitious, irrational, and controlling.
Right, the rascally deists and all that. They wanted to strip away the mystery.
But Romanticism offered a comeback for religion, specifically through movements like Methodism and figures like John Wesley.
John Wesley, he is the guy who founded the Methodist movement. What was his romantic moment?
Well, for years, Wesley was a very diligent Anglican priest. He tried to find peace through strict obedience, what you might call a mountain of good deeds. He followed all the rituals, did all the work. He was very logical about his faith.
Very structured, very Enlightenment.
But he felt completely empty. He had no peace. Then, in the mid-18th century, he had a profound experience while listening to a reading of Martin Luther. He famously described it as feeling his heart strangely warmed.
Strangely warmed. That sounds very internal, very subjective.
That is the key. It was a personal, emotional encounter with the divine. He moved away from the idea that religion was about checking boxes or institutional ritual and toward the idea of a conversion experience.
So it is not about what you do, it is about what you feel.
It is about a personal relationship. The Methodist movement spread like wildfire, especially among the working class, because it prioritized that emotional connection. It was a romantic religion because it bypassed the logic of theology and went straight to the heart.
It is amazing how consistent this pattern is across the board. In every single field, they are tearing down the wall between the person and the experience. They want to remove the filter of logic and just let the raw emotion hit them.
And that had massive political implications, too. We touched on nationalism with the Grimm brothers, but we really have to look at the broader picture. The French Revolution itself demonstrated the immense emotional power of a people united.
We usually think of the French Revolution as the direct result of Enlightenment ideas, though. You know, liberty, equality, fraternity.
The ideas were Enlightenment ideas, yes, but the energy, the actual execution, that was pure Romanticism. It wasn't a logical debate in a salon. It was a riot of emotion in the streets.
It was a massive release of passion.
Yeah, exactly. And while the Enlightenment might have provided the theories about rights and laws, Romanticism provided the passion to storm the Bastille. People began viewing their national identity as an extension of their individual spirit. This led to revolutions, wars, and the complete reshaping of the map of Europe.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? When we look back at this romantic rebellion, it really feels like a massive pendulum swing in human history.
It absolutely was a pendulum swing. You went from reason to intuition, from scientific rigor to imagination, from universalism, the idea that we are all the same rational creatures, to individualism and nationalism, highlighting what makes us uniquely different.
And from neoclassical restraint, keeping it cool, to total emotional exuberance.
But I think the most important thing to take away from all these sources is that this wasn't just a trend. It wasn't like bell-bottoms going in and out of style. This was a fundamental change in how humans viewed reality itself.
Right. It challenged the idea that if you can't measure something, it doesn't matter.
Exactly. It prioritized the why and the how it feels over just the what. The Enlightenment gave us the tools to build the industrial world, the technology, the medicine, the infrastructure. But the Romantics reminded us that we aren't just cogs in that machine.
That is a really powerful distinction. The Enlightenment builds the car, but the Romantics decide where to drive it and what music to blast on the way.
That is a great analogy. You need
Yeah.
the engineering, but you also desperately need the destination.
I want to leave you with a thought here as we wrap up. We live in a world right now that is incredibly data-driven. Algorithms predict what we buy, metrics track our productivity, science explains our biology. In a lot of ways, we are living in the ultimate Enlightenment dream. We have maximized efficiency.
We really have. We quantify everything we possibly can.
But looking at the Romantic Rebellion, you have to ask yourself, do we need that rebellion again? If the Enlightenment gave us the ability to build this complex, industrial, digital world, did we need the Romantics to remind us that we are human? And do we need that reminder today?
I think that is the crucial question to walk away with. Perhaps true understanding requires both. You need the map, which is reason, but you also need the desire to explore the territory, and that is pure emotion.
Without the map, you are lost. But without the desire, you never even leave the house.
Precise.
That is a perfect place to leave it for this deep dive. A huge thank you to everyone listening. Go find something sublime today. Maybe stare at some fog or just listen to some Beethoven at max volume.
So don't break the furniture.
No promises. Thanks for listening.